Robby, what's on your radar this morning?
Here's a question. Why do politicians and members of the mainstream media automatically assume that every tragedy is actually a hate crime or a terrorist attack, even before all the facts come in? This weekend brought yet another example after a car ran over and killed a man at a pride parade in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The perpetrator was initially presumed to be an anti-gay zealot making a political statement, but it later turned out the driver was a participant in the parade. The tragedy now appears to have been an unfortunate accident. Fort Lauderdale Mayor Dean Trantalis didn't waste any time, though. On Twitter, he initially called the accident a terrorist attack against the LGBT community. It was deliberate, it was premeditated, and it was targeted against a specific person. Since none of those things are true, he has now reversed course and admitted he leapt to conclusions. And he wasn't the only one. LGBTQ people are literally being murdered at pride parades in Florida, tweeted Steve Silberman of Wired. Some who bought into the false idea that the attack was a hate crime also blamed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. They even succeeded at making #DeathSantis a trending topic on Twitter. But none of that is accurate. The attack, which wasn't an attack at all, but rather a tragic accident, had nothing to do with anti-gay hate or Ron DeSantis' anti-rioting bill. Sadly, this is hardly the first time that Team Blue has wrongly politicized a tragedy. Remember the Atlanta spa killings? That terrible tragedy prompted widespread alarm about the supposedly rising tide of anti-Asian racism in the wake of COVID-19 and former President Trump's China rhetoric. The Senate even passed a new bill aimed at countering anti-Asian hate crimes. Josh Hawley was the lone no vote on that bill. Meanwhile, countless think pieces in the mainstream media say that white supremacy is the root of all of this violence. Yet no evidence has emerged that the spa killer was motivated by anti-Asian racism. And the perpetrators of attacks on Asian Americans in New York City and other places are often mentally ill, often homeless, and often, importantly, non-white. The media wants you to believe that we're living in a time of rising hatred and that black people, Asian people, trans people, gay people, and immigrants are routinely being targeted because of their identity. Now, let me be crystal clear on this. Members of these groups are sometimes the victims of crimes. And in some of those cases, that violence was clearly motivated by animus. These crimes should be investigated and prosecuted. But here's the thing. There just isn't a lot of evidence that the problem is getting worse. Indeed, according to the FBI's own data, the rate of hate crimes was probably higher in the 1990s than it is today. Watchdog groups regularly inflate hate crime statistics in a bid to stay relevant and to convince the mainstream media to keep covering them. And for whatever reason, crime doesn't really matter to the people in charge unless it fits a politically convenient narrative. These days, liberals really like to make every issue about race and identity, which means violent crime is framed as a problem of white supremacists targeting vulnerable minorities. In reality, ideologically motivated crime is one of the smallest categories of violence in the last 20 years. I'm harping on these statistics because it makes me mad when the pundit class tries to scare people into thinking things are a lot worse than they actually are. If violence against minorities and members of the LGBT community is on the rise, then many people might be duped into supporting bad new laws that give the government more power to spy on citizens. These laws tend to stick around forever. Think of the Patriot Act or the TSA. It's true that many social problems intersect with crime: homelessness, joblessness, mental illness, and others. But hate, as defined by federal law, just isn't a leading driver of crime. It only seems like it is because public officials and their sycophants in the media keep ginning up hysteria about hate crimes, usually before all the facts come in. If they just reported the news soberly and waited to hear all the details before leaping to conclusions, they would often find out, as we did over the weekend, that their initial assumptions were wrong.
Yeah, Robby, I've got to say, that's a great radar, and interestingly enough, I tend to agree with you here. Now, well, look, I think the injustices that are hate crimes, and I think what people have been reacting to in some recent years is more the openness about it, not necessarily the rise or lack thereof, as you point out via FBI data, but just kind of like the people have been a little bit more overt about things. But I think when you jump to conclusions, as you point out, and then it shows that those conclusions were actually dead wrong before finding out what really happened here, you actually hurt the cause of keeping more people protected from hate crimes. Because it goes to what you say, that people are jumping to conclusions and people are overreacting to a situation that isn't fully fleshed out yet, and ultimately that's bad for everybody. Nobody wants to, I think, live in an environment where hate crimes exist on either side of the aisle, right? Whether they're liberals or whether they're Republicans. I just don't think it's something that Americans generally approve of, right? But when it's overly highlighted in the news, and incorrectly so, often you just lead yourself to a path of saying, they're doing that same thing again, and people ultimately in the end will pay less attention to it, and that's a problem.
I mean, that's the problem with journalism, with the news media, especially with television media. Say, if it bleeds, it leads. Yeah. There are no stories about how there were no hate crimes today, everyone mostly got along, nobody smashed anybody's windows, etc. When it happens, that's when it's a story. And so then you think it's getting worse. And also, crime is just a problem more generally. We don't always know. So I've covered a lot of campus hate crime incidents. Those are the ones that tend to get solved. To the extent they are solved, often it's the perpetrator does it in some kind of warped psychological bid for attention. I'm not saying that's typical of the broader landscape of hate crimes, but it does happen. There's think of Jussie Smollett. Remember that whole incident?
Sure.
And obviously, that if you attach yourself to that cause before all the facts are out, then you end up hurting, if your side is advocacy for racial justice or LGBT justice or whatever it is, and you attach yourself to people who portray themselves as victims, well, then you end up looking foolish if the story goes the other way, as it immediately did in this case.
Yeah. And, I think it's a good thing that people are paying more attention to what could be termed hate crimes in recent years than maybe they had in the past. Because ultimately you have to shine the light on something to kind of be, for the light to be the antiseptic in the situation, if you will. And let people know that these things exist. But ultimately, again, I think it's detrimental when we point to everything as being one of those things and not really finding out what things are in reality.
Because there's tons of violence just in Chicago. There are people stabbing each other and shooting each other. It doesn't fit an interesting narrative to the mainstream media about racism or something else, but it's still terrible. We should still do something about it.
Yeah, and we should talk about it.
There are office shootings and it's workplace violence or suicides. There's so many bad social ills that we need to solve, but it's just, they don't garner the same attention for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, look, shiny nickel syndrome, right? It's what is shiny today. It is a problem. It certainly does exist, and we should do everything we can to correct it and make sure that people are protected no matter what groups culturally or, whether they're part of the LGBTQ community or any other group that is under attack in the United States today by some actors, bad actors.
Right.
We shouldn't overemphasize and push people more into their kind of partisan corners than we presently are. And I think, alluding to things being hate crimes when they're not just pushes us farther into there. Great reaction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, Ryan Grimm and Philip Wegman join us for Team Rising.